Hi, my name's Jessica, and last Thanksgiving my sister Michelle stood up at our family dinner table, raised her wine glass, and announced to everyone that I was still stuck in the same dead-end paper-pushing job I'd had for years, while she was closing million-dollar real estate deals. She laughed as she said it, that condescending laugh she'd perfected since we were kids, and suggested maybe it was time I considered a real career instead of wasting my life shuffling documents. For the government, the whole table went quiet, 23 relatives suddenly finding their mashed potatoes fascinating. What Michelle didn't know was that 3 days later, I'd be sworn in as the youngest female senator in my state's history, and the Secret Service would be addressing me as Madam Senator for the first time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The thing about working in government is that most people have no idea what you actually do. When I started as a junior policy analyst at the Department of Health and Human Services 6 years ago, fresh out of graduate school with my master's in public administration, my family treated it like I'd taken a job at the DMV. Michelle, who was 3 years older and had already started making serious money in commercial real estate, would introduce me at parties as her little sister who works for the government doing something with paperwork. She'd wrinkle her nose when she said it, like the words left a bad taste in her mouth. I should have corrected her, should have explained that I was actually researching healthcare policy implementation, analyzing data that would affect millions of Americans, writing briefings that crossed the desks of cabinet secretaries. But Michelle had this way of making you feel small without even trying, a talent she'd inherited from our mother Linda, who had spent 30 years climbing the corporate ladder at a pharmaceutical company and believed that anything that didn't come with a 6-figure salary and a corner office wasn't worth discussing. Our father Robert was different, quieter, more supportive in his understated way. He'd worked as a high school principal for 40 years before retiring, and he understood the value of public service, even if he didn't always understand what I was doing day to day. But at family gatherings, Mom and Michelle's voices always dominated the conversation, and Dad would just nod along, occasionally catching my eye with a small smile that said he was proud of me even if he couldn't quite articulate why. Those early years at HHS were exactly what you'd expect from government work in some ways. Long hours, modest pay, bureaucracy that moved at the speed of molasses. But what my family didn't see was the incredible access I was gaining to how policy actually gets made in this country. I wasn't just pushing papers around. I was sitting in on meetings where decisions affecting healthcare for millions of Americans were being hammered out. I was briefing senior officials on the real-world impacts of proposed legislation. I was building relationships with people who would later become senators, governors, cabinet secretaries. More importantly, I was learning how to navigate the complex ecosystem of Washington politics, how to build coalitions, how to find compromise between competing interests, how to translate complex policy into language that regular people could understand. These weren't skills you could learn in business school or pick up selling real estate. They were the foundation of effective governance, and I was getting a masterclass in them every single day. Michelle, meanwhile, was making good money flipping commercial properties in Northern Virginia, and she never let anyone forget it. Every family dinner became an opportunity for her to talk about her latest deal, the important clients she was meeting, the exclusive events she was attending. When the conversation turned to me, which it rarely did voluntarily, she'd pat my hand condescendingly and say things like, "Well, at least Jessica has job security. Government workers never get fired, right?" The implication was clear. I was playing it safe, taking the easy route, lacking the ambition and drive that had made her successful. What she didn't know was that I'd been quietly building something much bigger than a real estate portfolio. By my 3rd year at HHS, I'd caught the attention of Senator Patricia Thompson, a moderate Democrat who was known for her bipartisan approach to healthcare reform. Senator Thompson had been fighting for years to pass comprehensive mental health legislation, and she needed someone who understood both the policy details and the political landscape well enough to help navigate the bill through Congress. I started working part-time for Senator Thompson while maintaining my position at HHS, spending evenings and weekends on the Hill, learning the rhythms of the Senate, understanding how relationships and reputation mattered as much as policy knowledge. Senator Thompson became my mentor, teaching me not just about legislation, but about the art of politics itself. How to listen to what people weren't saying, how to find common ground between seeming opposites, how to build trust across party lines. The mental health bill we worked on together became my first real taste of legislative success. It took 2 years of negotiations, compromises, and late-night strategy sessions, but when it finally passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, I felt something I'd never experienced in all my years of policy analysis: the satisfaction of seeing your work directly improve people's lives. Within 6 months of the bill's passage, suicide prevention programs were being expanded nationwide, mental health services were being integrated into primary care settings, and insurance coverage for mental health treatment was being strengthened. But when I tried to share this victory with my family at Christmas dinner that year, Michelle interrupted me halfway through explaining the bill's impact to tell everyone about a shopping center she'd just sold for $12 million. "At least one of us is making real money," she said with that familiar laugh. "Jessica's still saving the world one form at a time." Mom nodded approvingly at Michelle's success, while Dad asked a few polite questions about my work before the IQ. Conversation inevitably shifted back to real estate market trends. That was the pattern for years. Every holiday, every birthday party, every family gathering became a subtle reminder that my career choice was seen as noble, but ultimately unimportant. A phase I'd hopefully grow out of once I realized I needed to make serious money. Michelle's success was celebrated and discussed at length, while my work was acknowledged with the kind of polite interest you'd show someone's hobby. The fact that I was influencing policy that affected millions of people mattered less than the fact that I couldn't afford the kind of car Michelle drove or the expensive vacations she took. What my family couldn't see was the network I was building, the reputation I was developing, the skills I was accumulating. By my 5th year in government, I wasn't just a policy analyst anymore. I was Senator Thompson's chief of staff, managing her entire legislative agenda, coordinating with other Senate offices on major bills, representing her in high-level meetings with lobbyists, advocacy groups, and other stakeholders. I was 31 years old and had more access to real political power than most people achieve in entire careers. But when I mentioned my promotion to chief of staff at Michelle's birthday party, she responded by announcing that she'd just been named partner at her real estate firm. "Finally, someone in this family is moving up in the world," Mom said, raising her glass to Michelle. The fact that I was now one of the youngest chief of staff positions in the Senate didn't seem worth mentioning in comparison. The irony was that Michelle's success, while impressive, was ultimately limited to her own bank account. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My work was affecting healthcare policy, veterans benefits, education funding, environmental protection, issues that touched every American family, including ours. But because government salaries are public record and relatively modest compared to private sector success stories, my family saw my career as a cautionary tale rather than an achievement. The shift began during Senator Thompson's re-election campaign in my 6th year as her chief of staff. I'd been managing not just her legislative agenda, but increasingly her political strategy as well. I understood her district better than anyone, knew which issues resonated with which constituencies, had built relationships with local party leaders, union representatives, business groups, and community organizations across the state. When Senator Thompson decided not to seek re-election, citing health concerns and a desire to spend more time with her grandchildren, she didn't just recommend me as her replacement, she spent months actively campaigning for me to receive the party's nomination. The announcement that I was running for Senate came as a complete shock to my family. I'd kept my political ambitions quiet, partly because I wasn't sure they'd come to fruition, and partly because I was tired of having my career choices dissected and found wanting at family dinners. When I called to tell them about my candidacy, the silence on the other end of the phone was telling. "Senator?" Michelle finally said. "Like, an actual senator? In Washington?" As if there might be some other kind of senator I was referring. Tuto, Mom's first question was about the salary, which she looked up online while we were still talking and declared surprisingly reasonable for such an important position. Dad was the only one who seemed genuinely excited, asking detailed questions about the campaign process and offering to volunteer however he could help. The campaign itself was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Running for Senate meant months of 18-hour days, traveling to every corner of the state, attending pancake breakfasts and union halls and church services, explaining my vision for healthcare reform, economic development, education funding, and environmental protection. To anyone who would listen, it meant raising money from small donors and major contributors, building a staff of talented organizers and communication specialists, developing policy positions on everything from trade agreements to infrastructure spending. But it also meant dealing with a level of scrutiny I'd never faced before. Every vote I'd recommended to Senator Thompson, every position I'd taken on controversial issues, every relationship I'd built over 6 years in Washington was examined and sometimes criticized. Opposition research teams dug through my college transcripts, my social media posts, my graduate school thesis on healthcare policy implementation. The local newspapers profiled my background, my qualifications, my vision for the state's future. Through it all, my family's reaction remained somewhat bewildered. They understood that running for Senate was impressive, but they didn't quite grasp how someone who'd spent 6 years in what they considered a mundane government job had suddenly become qualified for such high office. Michelle, to her credit, contributed to my campaign and even attended a few fundraising events, but there was always an undercurrent of surprise in her voice when she introduced me to her friends as my sister, the Senate candidate. The polls throughout the campaign were tight, within the margin of error for months. My opponent was a well-known businessman who'd run unsuccessfully for governor 4 years earlier, but had maintained high name recognition and a substantial war chest. He argued that Washington needed more outsiders, more people with private sector experience, fewer career politicians and bureaucrats. I countered that effective governance required understanding how government actually works, that my 6 years of policy experience had prepared me to be effective from day one rather than spending months learning the ropes. The decisive moment came during our final debate, when my opponent criticized my limited real-world experience outside the government bubble. I responded by walking through specific pieces of legislation I'd helped craft, explaining how the mental health bill had reduced suicide rates in our state by 15%. How the Veterans Health Care Initiative I'd designed had eliminated wait times at our VA hospitals. How the education funding formula I'd developed had increased teacher salaries and reduced class sizes in rural districts. I wasn't speaking in abstract policy terms. I was describing concrete improvements to people's lives that had resulted directly from my work. My opponent talks about real-world experience, I said, looking directly into the camera. I've spent 6 years working on real-world problems that affect real families in this state. While he was buying and selling businesses, I was writing the policies that help those businesses' employees get mental health coverage. While he was calculating profit margins, I was calculating how to expand healthcare access to underserved communities. Government service isn't separate from the real world. It's how we solve real-world problems together. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media lit up with people sharing their own stories of how the policies I'd worked on had affected their families. Veterans talked about improved health care. Teachers talked about better working conditions. Parents talked about mental health services that had helped their children. For the first time in the campaign, the conversation shifted from my qualifications to my record of actual achievement. Election night was a blur of nervous energy, constant phone calls, and incremental vote tallies that slowly but steadily moved in my direction. By 10:30, the major networks were calling the race in my favor. I'd won by nearly 8 percentage points, a decisive victory that reflected not just voter approval of my message, but genuine enthusiasm for my candidacy. At 33, I was going to be the youngest female senator in my state's history. The victory party was held at a hotel ballroom downtown, packed with supporters, volunteers, donors, and local party officials who'd worked tirelessly for months to make this moment possible. Senator Thompson introduced me to the crowd, talking about my dedication, my policy expertise, my vision for the state's future. When I took the microphone to deliver my victory speech, looking out at hundreds of people who'd believed in my candidacy, enough to invest their time and money in it, I felt a sense of responsibility and privilege that was almost overwhelming. But it was the next morning that everything really changed. I was having coffee in my apartment, still trying to process the reality of being senator-elect, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "Ms. Martinez, this is Agent Sarah Johnson with the United States Secret Service. Congratulations on your election victory. We'll be coordinating with you regarding security arrangements for your swearing-in ceremony and ongoing protection protocols. Would you prefer we address you as Senator-elect Martinez or Madam Senator during our briefings?" The title hit me like a physical force. Madam Senator. Not Jessica from the policy office. Not Michelle's little sister who works for the government. Not the girl who chose public service over profit. Madam Senator. A title that carried with it the weight of history, the responsibility of representing nearly 4 million people, the privilege of helping shape national policy on everything from healthcare to climate change to economic development. "Madam Senator is fine," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for several minutes, letting the reality sink in. In 3 weeks, I'd be sworn in as a United States Senator. The same job that Michelle had dismissively called shuffling papers for the government had led to the highest elected office in my state. The swearing-in ceremony took place on a bright January morning in the Capitol building, surrounded by the marble columns and oil paintings that had witnessed the oaths of senators for more than 2 centuries. My entire family was there, sitting in the gallery watching as I raised my right hand and swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Mom was crying, Dad was beaming with pride, and Michelle looked like she was still trying to process how her little sister had ended up taking the oath of office for the United States Senate. The reception afterward was a whirlwind of congratulations, introductions to other senators and their families, and the subtle choreography of Washington protocol that I'd been learning for 6 years, but was now experiencing from an entirely different perspective. When a senior Republican senator introduced me to his wife as the new senator from our state, it felt surreal. When a lobbyist who'd ignored me for years as Senator Thompson's chief of staff suddenly appeared at my elbow wanting to discuss healthcare policy, the shift in dynamics was almost amusing. But the moment that crystallized everything happened, near the end of the reception. I was talking with Senator Thompson about the transition when Michelle approached, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the grandeur of the Capitol building and the formality of the occasion. "Jessica," she said, and then caught herself. "I mean, Senator Martinez. God, that's going to take some getting used to." She paused, looking around at the senators and staff members and lobbyists who filled the reception room. "I have to ask, when you were working in that office all those years, writing those reports and going to those meetings, did you know this was where it was leading?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since election night. Had I known, on that first day as a junior policy analyst, that I was beginning a path that would lead to the Senate? Had I understood that the boring government job Michelle had mocked was actually an apprenticeship in governance, a graduate course in how democracy actually functions? "I knew I was learning something important," I said finally. "I knew the work mattered, Even when it didn't seem glamorous or profitable, I knew I was building relationships and developing skills that would serve me well whatever I did next. But did I know I'd end up here? No, I didn't know that was possible until Senator Thompson suggested it. Michelle nodded, processing this. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "All those years, I thought you were playing it safe, settling for less than you could achieve. I didn't understand that you were building something bigger than a career. You were building a foundation for this." She gestured around the room. "I'm proud of you, really proud." The conversation with Michelle was healing in a way I hadn't expected. For years, her criticism of my career choices had stung, not because I doubted the value of my work, but because I wanted her approval. Wanted my family to understand that public service could be just as meaningful and challenging as private sector success. Her acknowledgement that she'd misunderstood what I was doing, that she now saw the path from policy analyst to senator as one of steady preparation rather than lack of ambition, felt like a validation I'd been seeking for years. But more than that, it clarified something important about the nature of public service itself. The work I'd done at HHS, the late nights spent crafting legislation, the endless meetings with stakeholders and advocates, the careful analysis of policy impacts, none of that had been preparation for something else. It had been the work itself, the daily practice of democracy, the incremental process of making government more effective and responsive to people's needs. The transition from senator-elect to sitting senator was intense and exhilarating. There were staff to hire, committee assignments to negotiate, an office to set up, a legislative agenda to develop. I was assigned to the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which felt like a natural fit given my background, and the Environment and Public Works Committee, which would allow me to work on infrastructure and climate issues that were increasingly important to my state's economy. My first speech on the Senate floor was about healthcare access in rural communities, an issue I'd been working on for 6 years and understood from both policy and political perspectives. Standing at the podium where some of the greatest figures in American history had made their cases for civil rights, economic justice, and national security was humbling and inspiring. When I finished speaking and returned to my seat, several colleagues stopped by to congratulate me on a strong debut. But what mattered most was knowing that the speech would help advance legislation that would directly improve healthcare for thousands of families in underserved areas. The adjustment period wasn't without its challenges. Being a senator meant being a public figure in a way that chief of staff work hadn't required. Every vote was scrutinized. Every public statement was analyzed. Every position I took on controversial issues was debated by constituents, advocacy groups, and political opponents. The responsibility of representing nearly 4 million people, of being accountable to voters with diverse and sometimes conflicting interests, was more complex than any challenge I'd faced in 6 years of government service. But it was also incredibly rewarding. Within my first year, I was able to pass legislation expanding mental health services in schools, secure federal funding for infrastructure improvements in rural communities, and help broker a bipartisan compromise on climate change adaptation that had been stalled for months. The skills I'd developed as a policy analyst and chief of staff, building coalitions, finding common ground, translating complex issues into understandable terms, turned out to be exactly what effective senatorial work required. The real vindication came during my first Christmas as senator, when the family gathered at Mom and Dad's house for our traditional holiday dinner. This time, when the conversation turned to career updates, I found myself describing the mental health legislation I'd been working on, the infrastructure projects I'd secured funding for, the bipartisan relationships I'd been building with colleagues from both parties. But what was different wasn't just that I had bigger accomplishments to share. It was that my family finally understood the continuity between the boring government job they'd tolerated for years and the Senate seat they now celebrated. Michelle, who'd spent years encouraging me to leave government for more lucrative private sector work, was now asking detailed questions about the legislative process and offering to host fundraising events for my future campaigns. You know, what I realized, Mom said as we were cleaning up after dinner, all those years when I thought you were just getting by, just playing it safe, you were actually building something extraordinary. You weren't avoiding the real world. You were learning how to change it. It was the kind of recognition I'd wanted for years, but by the time it came, I no longer needed it for validation. The work itself had been its own reward, and the platform I now had to advance policies that would improve people's lives was more satisfying than any family approval could be. But it was nice, finally, to have my career path understood and appreciated rather than questioned and pitied. As I settled into my second year as senator, I often thought about that Thanksgiving dinner when Michelle had mocked my dead-end paper-pushing job in front of the entire family. The assumption behind her criticism, that government work was somehow less valuable or challenging than private sector success, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how democracy actually functions. The senators and representatives who make our laws, the policy analysts who research their impacts, the staff members who negotiate compromises and build coalitions, these aren't people who couldn't succeed in business. They're people who chose to use their talents in service of something larger than personal profit. The path from junior policy analyst to United States Senator hadn't been planned, but it hadn't been accidental either. Every report I'd written, every meeting I'd attended, every relationship I'd built had been preparation for the work I was now doing. The difference was that I'd finally reached a position where the value of that preparation was visible to everyone, including my family, who'd spent years wondering when I'd get serious about my career. Standing in the Senate chamber during important votes, listening to debates that would shape policy for millions of Americans, I often remembered that first day at HHS when I'd been so nervous about making a good impression, so eager to prove I belonged in the world of Washington politics. The young woman who'd started as a junior analyst had been right to believe the work mattered, right to invest herself fully in learning how government really operates, right to choose public service over more lucrative alternatives. The title, Madam Senator, still gave me chills when the Secret Service used it, when colleagues addressed me on the floor, when constituents approached me at public events. But it was more than just a symbol of personal achievement. It was a reminder of the responsibility that came with the position, the obligation to use this platform effectively, the commitment to justify the trust that voters had placed in me. And sometimes when Michelle introduced me to her friends as my sister, the senator, I could hear the genuine pride in her voice, the understanding that the career path she'd once dismissed as unambitious had actually been the most ambitious choice I could have made. Because changing the world, it turned out, required exactly the kind of patience, preparation, and persistence that 6 years of boring government work had taught me to value. The real test of my Senate career came during my second year, when a massive healthcare crisis hit our state that would either prove my policy expertise or expose me as someone who'd advanced too quickly through the political ranks. A pharmaceutical manufacturing plant in the eastern part of the state had been contaminating groundwater for years, and suddenly hundreds of families were dealing with health issues that no one could initially explain. Children were developing respiratory problems, adults were experiencing neurological symptoms, and the local healthcare system was completely overwhelmed. When the news first broke, my immediate reaction was to reach back to everything I'd learned during my 6 years at HHS. This wasn't just a political crisis that required press conferences and finger-pointing. It was a public health emergency that demanded coordinated response between federal agencies, state health departments, local medical facilities, and environmental protection teams. While other senators might have focused on assigning blame or scoring political points, I knew the first priority had to be getting people the medical care they needed and stopping further contamination. I spent the first 72 hours after the story broke essentially living at the affected site, coordinating with the EPA, the CDC, and FEMA to establish emergency medical screening stations and begin the complex process of environmental remediation. The relationships I'd built during my years in government service became invaluable. I knew exactly who to call at each agency, understood the bureaucratic processes that could either expedite or delay response efforts, and had credibility with career civil servants who might have been skeptical of a politician showing up to manage a technical crisis. Michelle called me on the second day of the crisis, her voice tight with concern. "I've been watching the news coverage," she said. "This looks really serious. Are you okay? Are you safe being there?" It was the first time in our adult lives that she'd expressed worry about my physical safety because of my job. Real estate deals, no matter how complex or high stakes, didn't typically involve potential exposure to industrial toxins or managing emergency response operations in hazmat suits. "I'm fine," I told her, standing outside the mobile command center that had been set up in a school parking lot. "But hundreds of families aren't, and that's what matters right now." I explained how we were coordinating medical screenings, how the environmental cleanup would work, how we were ensuring that affected families would receive comprehensive healthcare coverage for any ongoing treatment they might need. "You actually know how to do all this," Michelle said, and there was something like awe in her voice. "I mean, I know you're smart, but listening to you explain the coordination between all these different agencies, it's like you've been preparing for exactly this kind of crisis your entire career." She wasn't wrong. The skills I'd developed analyzing healthcare policy implementation at HHS, the relationships I'd built with federal agency staff, the understanding I'd gained of how emergency response coordination actually works, all of it was directly applicable to managing this crisis. But more than that, the patience I'd learned during years of slow-moving bureaucratic processes had taught me that effective crisis response isn't about dramatic gestures or quick fixes. It's about methodical coordination, clear communication, and sustained attention to detail over weeks and months. The contamination crisis lasted 4 months from initial discovery to final environmental clearance, and managing the response became a master class in applied governance. Every day brought new challenges that required both technical expertise and political skill. We had to coordinate between 12 different federal agencies, the state environmental department, 3 county health departments, and dozens of local medical providers. We had to keep hundreds of affected families informed about their health, risks, and treatment options while also managing a media environment that demanded constant updates and clear explanations of highly complex scientific issues. One of the most difficult aspects was dealing with the pharmaceutical company responsible for the contamination. Their initial response was predictable: deny responsibility, minimize the scope of the problem, offer inadequate compensation to affected families while fighting any admission of legal liability. But I'd spent enough time working on healthcare policy to understand exactly how corporate responsibility for environmental health damages should be handled, and I wasn't willing to let them control the narrative or the response. Working with the Justice Department, we developed a comprehensive legal strategy that would hold the company accountable, not just for cleanup costs, but for long-term health monitoring and treatment for anyone affected by the contamination. This wasn't just about getting money from a corporation, it was about ensuring that families dealing with health consequences from this exposure would have access to medical care for as long as they needed it, potentially for the rest of their lives. The negotiations with the pharmaceutical company were intense and sometimes hostile. Their lawyers tried every standard corporate defense strategy, questioning the science linking their facility to health problems, arguing that cleanup standards were unnecessarily stringent, claiming that long-term health monitoring was excessive and couldn't be directly tied to their operations. But my years of experience with healthcare policy had taught me to anticipate these arguments and prepare responses based on solid scientific evidence and legal precedent. Senator Martinez, their lead attorney, said during one particularly tense negotiation session, "You're asking for an unprecedented level of corporate responsibility for what may turn out to be minor health impacts that can't be definitively linked to our clients' operations." His tone was condescending, clearly calculated to make me feel like I was overreaching, demanding something unreasonable. I looked across the conference table at him, thinking about the families I'd met during medical screenings, the children, whose parents were terrified about long-term health consequences, the adults whose symptoms were affecting their ability to work and support their families. "What's unprecedented," I replied calmly, "is allowing a company to contaminate groundwater for years without detection. What we're asking for is comprehensive accountability that matches the scope of harm your client has caused." The back and forth continued for weeks, but eventually we reached a settlement that included full environmental cleanup, comprehensive health monitoring for affected residents, establishment of a medical trust fund for ongoing treatment, and significant penalties that would deter similar behavior by other companies. The total value exceeded $200 million, making it one of the largest environmental health settlements in our state's history. But what mattered more than the money was the precedent it set. Other senators from both parties began reaching out to understand how we'd managed the crisis response so effectively, how we'd coordinated between so many different agencies, how we'd negotiated such a comprehensive settlement with a major corporation. I found myself being invited to speak at conferences about environmental health policy, being asked to consult on similar crises in other states, being recognized as someone who understood both the technical and political aspects of environmental health protection. The media coverage of the crisis response was overwhelmingly positive, but what struck me most was how different the tone was from typical political reporting. Instead of focusing on partisan conflicts or electoral implications, journalists were writing about the complexity of coordinating federal emergency response, the challenges of environmental health policy, the importance of having senators who understood how government agencies actually worked. One profile in a national magazine described me as a policy wonk's policy wonk, someone whose deep understanding of government operations made her unusually effective at solving complex problems. When I read that description to Michelle during one of our weekly phone calls, she laughed. "Remember when Mom used to worry that you were too much of a wonk to succeed in politics? Now being a wonk is your political brand." She paused, then added more seriously, "I've been following the coverage of how you handled the contamination crisis. It's amazing watching you in your element like this. You make it look easy, but I know it's not." She was right that it wasn't easy, but what surprised me was how natural it felt. The crisis response had required exactly the kind of sustained attention to detail, stakeholder coordination, and long-term strategic thinking that I'd been developing throughout my government career. The difference was that now I had the authority and platform to implement solutions, rather than just analyzing problems and making recommendations to other people. The success of the contamination crisis response led to new opportunities that I hadn't anticipated. The Senate Majority Leader asked me to join a bipartisan working group on environmental health policy, recognizing that I'd demonstrated both technical expertise and the ability to work effectively with federal agencies. The EPA Administrator invited me to participate in developing new guidelines for industrial contamination response that would be implemented nationwide. The CDC asked me to serve on an advisory committee for environmental health monitoring in communities affected by industrial pollution. Each of these roles built on the others, creating a reputation for expertise that extended far beyond my own state's boundaries. Within 6 months of the contamination crisis, I was being recognized as one of the Senate's leading voices on environmental health issues, someone whose opinion carried weight not just because of political positioning, but because of demonstrated competence in managing real-world crises. The transformation in how my family viewed my career was dramatic and sometimes amusing. Dad started sending me newspaper clippings about environmental issues from around the country, often with notes like, "Thought you might be interested in this," or "This reminds me of what you dealt with last year." Mom began introducing me to her friends as my daughter, the senator who handled that big contamination crisis you probably saw on the news. She'd developed a detailed understanding of environmental health policy that she'd never had before. And she was clearly proud of being able to explain to her bridge club how federal agency coordination worked during emergency response. But it was Michelle's reaction that meant the most to me. She'd always been competitive, always needed to be the successful sister, the one with impressive accomplishments and financial rewards. But during the contamination crisis, I watched her shift from seeing my career as a disappointment to seeing it as something she genuinely admired. She started asking detailed questions about policy development, about how legislation actually gets written and passed, about the difference between effective governance and political theater. "I've been thinking about something," she said during one of our conversations about 6 months after the crisis had been resolved. "You know how I always used to say you were playing it safe with the government job? I think I had it backwards. What you've been doing is actually much riskier than what I do. When I sell a property, the worst that happens is I lose money or a client gets upset. When you make policy decisions, you're affecting hundreds of thousands of people's lives. That's a huge responsibility." She was right about the responsibility, and it was something I thought about constantly. Every vote I cast, every piece of legislation I supported or opposed, every public statement I made had the potential to affect real people in ways that were sometimes difficult to predict or measure. The contamination crisis had made that responsibility tangible and immediate, but it was present in every aspect of Senate work. The healthcare bill I'd been working on with Senator Thompson before her retirement finally came up for a vote during my second year. And the debate was intense and sometimes personal. The legislation would expand mental health coverage, increase funding for rural health clinics, and establish new standards for emergency medical response in underserved areas. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive approach to healthcare policy that I'd been advocating for throughout my career, but it was also expensive and politically controversial. The opposition arguments were predictable but forceful. Republican senators criticized the cost, questioned whether federal programs were more effective than private sector solutions, argued that the legislation represented government overreach into healthcare decisions that should be left to individuals and their doctors. Some Democrats worried that the bill was too ambitious, that pushing for comprehensive reform might jeopardize other priorities, that incremental change might be more politically feasible. But I'd spent 6 years studying healthcare policy implementation, and I knew that incremental approaches often failed to address systemic problems that required coordinated solutions. During the floor debate, I spoke for nearly 20 minutes about the research behind each provision in the bill, the pilot programs that had demonstrated effectiveness, the cost-benefit analysis that showed long-term savings from improved prevention, and early intervention services. "My colleagues who oppose this legislation," I said, looking around the chamber at senators from both parties, "argue that we can't afford comprehensive healthcare reform. But the truth is that we can't afford not to make these investments. Every day we delay expanding mental health services, more families experience preventable tragedies. Every day we delay strengthening rural healthcare infrastructure, more communities lose access to basic medical care. Every day we delay improving emergency response capabilities. More people suffer preventable harm during crises like the contamination event my state experienced last year." The personal reference to the contamination crisis was calculated. I'd learned that abstract policy arguments were less persuasive than concrete examples of how government action could directly improve people's lives. Several senators who'd been undecided about the bill had visited my state during the crisis response and seen firsthand how effective coordination between federal agencies and local healthcare providers could be. The vote was closer than I'd hoped, but decisive enough to feel like a real victory. The bill passed 54 to 46, with support from 6 Republican senators who'd been persuaded by the evidence of effectiveness and the potential for long-term cost savings. It was the kind of bipartisan success that had become increasingly rare in Washington, and it demonstrated that policy expertise and careful relationship building could still overcome partisan divisions when the stakes were clear enough. Michelle was in the gallery watching the vote, having flown down from Virginia specifically to see the debate and final passage. Afterward, at the small celebration reception, she was clearly overwhelmed by the complexity and intensity of the legislative process. "I had no idea how much work went into getting a bill passed," she told me as we walked through the Capitol building toward my office. "I mean, I knew there were votes and debates, but watching you explain all the research and coordination that had gone into developing the policy, it's like watching someone demonstrate expertise I never knew existed." We stopped in the rotunda, looking up at the dome where light filtered down through the historical paintings and architectural details that had witnessed more than 2 centuries of American democracy. "You know what's funny?" Michelle continued. "I used to think politics was just arguing and posturing, people trying to score points or get reelected. But watching you work on that contamination crisis and now this healthcare bill, I can see that there's this whole other level that's about actually solving problems and making things work better." It was one of the most insightful observations anyone in my family had made about the difference between politics as theater and governance as policymaking. The healthcare bill represented 18 months of detailed research, stakeholder consultation, bipartisan negotiation, and careful attention to implementation challenges. The public debate and final vote were just the visible culmination of work that had been happening largely behind the scenes, in committee hearings and staff meetings and quiet conversations between senators who disagreed on principles but shared concerns about practical outcomes. The success of the healthcare legislation led to new leadership opportunities within the Senate Democratic Caucus. I was asked to serve on the Budget Committee, which would give me influence over spending priorities. Across all federal agencies, I was invited to join the Senate leadership's messaging team, helping to develop communication strategies for major legislative initiatives. Most significantly, I was appointed to chair a new subcommittee on emergency preparedness and response, which would oversee federal coordination for natural disasters, public health emergencies, and environmental crises. The subcommittee chairmanship was particularly meaningful because it formalized the expertise I'd demonstrated during the contamination crisis. Instead of being seen as a freshman senator who'd handled one emergency well, I was now recognized as someone who understood emergency management comprehensively enough to oversee federal preparedness efforts more broadly. The role came with additional staff, a larger budget for oversight activities, and the authority to conduct hearings on emergency response issues affecting communities across the country. One of my first hearings as subcommittee chair focused on industrial contamination prevention and response protocols. We brought in witnesses from the EPA, the CDC, representatives from affected communities, environmental health experts, and yes, executives from pharmaceutical and chemical companies, who were required to explain their contamination prevention procedures and emergency response capabilities. Watching the pharmaceutical executive who'd tried to minimize responsibility for the contamination in my state now testify under oath about his company's commitment to environmental protection was satisfying in a way that went beyond personal vindication. The hearing was being broadcast live, and thousands of people in communities across the country were seeing corporate executives held accountable for their environmental impact in a formal, official setting where evasion and denial were much more difficult. "Mr. Patterson," I said, addressing the executive whose company had caused the contamination crisis, "your company's internal documents, which we've obtained through our investigation, show that you were aware of groundwater contamination risks at your facility for 3 years before taking corrective action. Can you explain to the families affected by that contamination why your company chose not to address a known environmental hazard?" His answer was a masterpiece of corporate non-response, full of technical language and legal qualifications that avoided acknowledging any actual responsibility. But the public nature of the hearing, the formal setting, and the documented evidence made his evasion transparent in a way that private negotiations never could. The hearing transcript would become part of the permanent congressional record, and clips from the most damning exchanges would be shared widely on social media and news programs. More importantly, the hearing led to concrete policy changes. Based on the testimony and evidence presented, we developed legislation that would require faster reporting of potential contamination events, establish clearer protocols for emergency response coordination, and create stronger penalties for companies that failed to address known environmental hazards promptly. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support 6 months later, creating enforceable standards that would protect communities across the country from experiencing what my constituents had endured. The national profile that came with the subcommittee chairmanship and successful emergency response leadership began attracting attention from party leadership about potential future roles. There were quiet conversations about whether I might be interested in running for governor when the current incumbent's term ended, discussions about federal agency positions that might become available in a future Democratic administration, mentions of my name in speculative articles about rising stars in the party who might be considered for national tickets. All of this attention was flattering and somewhat surreal, but it also created pressure that I hadn't anticipated. Every public statement I made was analyzed not just for its policy content, but for its political implications. Every vote was evaluated in terms of how it might affect my future electoral prospects. Every interview was scrutinized for signs of ambition beyond the Senate or hints about future career plans. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same media and political establishment that had once dismissed my government career as unambitious was now speculating about just how ambitious my long-term political goals might be. The boring policy wonk had become someone whose political future was considered worth analyzing and predicting, whose expertise was seen as a potential platform for higher office, rather than a limitation that would keep me confined to technical roles. Michelle found this transformation endlessly amusing. Remember when you were worried that you'd never be taken seriously in politics because you were too focused on policy details? She said during one of our phone conversations. Now they're saying you might run for president someday because you're so good at policy details. It's like the thing that made you different turned out to be exactly what people were looking for. She wasn't entirely wrong, though the national political speculation felt premature and somewhat disconnected from the day-to-day work of being an effective senator. I was more interested in building on the emergency preparedness expertise I'd developed, expanding the subcommittee's oversight role, and working on comprehensive infrastructure legislation that would address the underlying vulnerabilities that made communities susceptible to environmental and public health crises. But I also recognized that the increased visibility and national recognition could be useful tools for advancing policy priorities that might otherwise struggle to get attention. Environmental health issues, emergency preparedness, rural health care, access. These weren't typically the subjects that attracted significant media coverage or political momentum. Having a platform that journalists and political commentators paid attention to meant I could bring national focus to issues that affected millions of people but rarely made headlines. The balance between policy substance and political positioning became a constant consideration. I wanted to use my growing influence to advance meaningful solutions to complex problems, but I also needed to maintain the relationships and credibility that made that influence possible. It was a more sophisticated version of the same challenge I'd faced as a junior policy analyst: how to be effective within existing systems while also working to change those systems for the better. During my third year in the Senate, a major hurricane hit the Gulf Coast, creating exactly the kind of multi-state emergency response challenge that my subcommittee had been studying and preparing for. The storm caused widespread flooding, knocked out power for millions of people, displaced hundreds of thousands of families, and overwhelmed state and local emergency management capabilities across 3 states. I spent 2 weeks in the affected region, working with FEMA, the National Guard, the Red Cross, and dozens of local organizations to coordinate rescue operations, establish temporary shelters, restore essential services, and begin long-term recovery planning. It was the contamination crisis response on a much larger scale, requiring coordination between even more agencies and stakeholders, affecting far more people, and demanding sustained attention for months rather than weeks. The experience reinforced everything I'd learned about the difference between effective governance and political theater. While some officials focused on photo opportunities and press conferences, the real work happened in command centers and emergency shelters and community meetings where detailed coordination decisions were made and resources were allocated based on careful assessment of actual needs rather than political considerations. Michelle flew down to volunteer during the recovery efforts, spending a week helping to organize supply distribution at a temporary shelter in Mississippi. It was the first time she'd seen me working in an emergency response environment, and the experience gave her a completely different perspective on what my job actually involved. "I've been watching you manage this disaster response," she said one evening as we were finishing our shift at the shelter, "and I finally understand what you've been trying to tell me about government work all these years. This isn't about bureaucracy or paperwork or political games. This is about organizing human beings to take care of each other when everything goes wrong." She was right, and her observation captured something essential about why I'd been drawn to public service in the first place. Government, at its best, was the mechanism through which communities could respond collectively to challenges that were too large or complex for individual solutions. The contamination crisis, the healthcare legislation, the hurricane response, all of them had required the kind of sustained, coordinated effort that only government institutions could organize and maintain. The hurricane response also demonstrated how much my approach to crisis management had evolved since those early days as a policy analyst. I was no longer just analyzing problems and making recommendations. I was making real-time decisions about resource allocation, personnel deployment, and strategic priorities that would directly affect thousands of people's immediate safety and long-term recovery prospects. When we finally returned to Washington after the emergency phase of the hurricane response was complete, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was different from anything I'd experienced in my previous government roles. The contamination crisis had been a test of whether I could apply my policy expertise to real-world problems. The hurricane response had been proof that I could lead effectively during genuine emergencies when lives were at stake, and there was no time for extended deliberation or political consultation. The national media coverage of my role in the hurricane response was extensive and almost universally positive. Editorial boards praised my hands-on leadership style and deep understanding of emergency management. Cable news programs featured clips of me briefing officials, coordinating with local leaders, and explaining recovery timelines to affected communities. Political commentators began describing me as the kind of senator who showed up when it mattered and delivered results rather than rhetoric. But what meant more to me than the media attention was the response from the communities that had been affected. Letters from families whose lives had been disrupted by the storm, thanking me for ensuring they had access to temporary housing or medical care or financial assistance during their recovery. Messages from local officials who'd worked with me during the crisis, describing how federal coordination had made their response efforts more effective. Invitations to speak at community events in the affected region, where people wanted to hear about long-term recovery planning and future preparedness improvements. The hurricane response also strengthened my working relationships with senators from both parties who represented affected states. When you've worked together 18 hours a day for 2 weeks to coordinate emergency response operations, partisan differences become much less important than shared commitment to getting things done effectively. Those relationships would prove valuable later when we needed bipartisan support for infrastructure legislation and emergency preparedness funding. By the end of my third year in the Senate, the trajectory that had begun with that first job as a junior policy analyst had reached a level of influence and recognition that would have been impossible to imagine when Michelle was mocking my boring government job at family dinners. But what struck me most was how organic and logical the progression had been. Each role had built on the previous one, each challenge had prepared me for the next level of responsibility, each success had opened doors to new opportunities for impact. The 6 years I'd spent at HHS and in Senator Thompson's office hadn't been preparation for my real career. They had been my real career, the foundation upon which everything else was built. The skills I'd developed, the relationships I'd formed, the expertise I'd gained in those supposedly mundane government positions had turned out to be exactly what effective Senate leadership required. The path from policy analyst to senator hadn't been a dramatic transformation so much as a steady evolution, each step building naturally on what had come before. And Michelle, who had once seen my government career as a cautionary tale about settling for less than I could achieve, now regularly told her friends that her sister was changing the world one policy at a time. The dismissive tone was gone, replaced by genuine pride and understanding of the complexity and importance of the work I was doing. She'd finally grasped that public service wasn't a consolation prize for people who couldn't succeed in the private sector. It was a calling that required its own forms of expertise, its own measures of success, and its own kinds of courage. The turning point in my Senate career came during my 4th year, when I discovered something that would transform not just my understanding of effective governance, but would ultimately expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of federal contracting. It started with what seemed like a routine oversight hearing for my Emergency Preparedness Subcommittee, reviewing federal spending on disaster response equipment and supplies. I was reviewing procurement records for emergency medical supplies when I noticed something odd about the pricing patterns. The same basic medical equipment was being purchased by different federal agencies at wildly different prices, sometimes varying by as much as 300% for identical items. A portable defibrillator that FEMA purchased for $1,500 was being bought by the Department of Health and Human Services for over $4,000. Emergency oxygen tanks that cost the military $800 were being procured by the CDC for nearly $3,000. At first, I assumed this was typical government inefficiency, the kind of bureaucratic waste that made for good political talking points but didn't necessarily indicate anything more serious than poor coordination between agencies. But my years of experience analyzing policy implementation had taught me to look for patterns. And the more I dug into the procurement data, the more systematic the discrepancies appeared. Michelle was visiting Washington for a long weekend, and I found myself explaining the procurement irregularities to her over dinner at a restaurant near the Capitol. "It's probably just typical government waste," she said, echoing my initial assumption. "Different agencies not talking to each other, everyone paying whatever price they're quoted without shopping around." But as I walked through the specific examples I'd found, even Michelle's business-trained eye began to pick up on the patterns that troubled me. "Wait," she said, putting down her fork and leaning forward. "You're saying the same company is selling identical products to different government agencies at completely different prices? And the agencies aren't comparing notes or negotiating better deals?" "That's what it looks like," I replied. "But here's what's really strange. The agencies paying the highest prices are consistently the ones with the largest emergency response budgets. It's like someone identified which agencies had the most money available and targeted them specifically with inflated pricing." Michelle's expression grew serious. "In real estate, when we see pricing patterns like that, it usually means someone's getting kickbacks. The buyer agrees to pay inflated prices in exchange for personal benefits, cash payments, gifts, job opportunities for family members, that kind of thing." Her observation crystallized something that had been nagging at me about the procurement data. This wasn't random inefficiency. It was too consistent, too targeted to be accidental. Someone was systematically overcharging federal agencies for emergency response equipment, and someone within those agencies was allowing it to happen. I spent the next 3 weeks diving deeper into the procurement records, using my subcommittee's oversight authority to request detailed documentation from 6 different federal agencies about their emergency equipment purchasing processes. What I found was a web of relationships between government procurement officers and a small network of suppliers that had been operating for at least 5 years. The scheme was sophisticated but not particularly well hidden once you knew what to look for. A group of companies, all with different names but sharing common ownership structures, had been winning no-bid emergency contracts by claiming they were the only suppliers capable of meeting urgent government needs. The procurement officers approving these contracts were later receiving consulting fees from related companies, or their family members were getting lucrative jobs with the supplier network, or they were being offered investment opportunities in real estate deals that guaranteed substantial returns. The total amount involved was staggering: over $600 million in overpayments for emergency equipment and supplies over a 5-year period. Money that should have been used to protect communities during disasters had instead been diverted into the pockets of corrupt officials and their private sector accomplices. But what made the scheme particularly insidious was its impact on emergency preparedness capabilities. Because agencies were paying inflated prices for basic equipment, they had less money available for training, personnel, and comprehensive planning. Communities that should have been better protected during natural disasters and public health emergencies were instead more vulnerable because corrupt officials had prioritized personal profit over public safety. I knew I was sitting on information that could destroy careers and potentially result in criminal charges for dozens of people. The question was how to proceed in a way that would ensure justice while also protecting the integrity of the ongoing emergency preparedness programs that communities depended on. My first call was to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, which had experience investigating procurement fraud in federal agencies. Special Agent Rachel Torres met with me in my office late on a Friday afternoon, bringing with her a level of intensity and focus that made it clear she understood the significance of what I'd discovered. "Senator Martinez," she said after reviewing the documentation I'd compiled, "this appears to be one of the largest procurement fraud schemes we've encountered in federal emergency management. The financial scope is substantial, but what concerns us most is the impact on national preparedness capabilities." Agent Torres explained that the FBI had been investigating reports of procurement irregularities in other federal agencies, but they hadn't identified the systematic nature of the scheme or its connection to emergency preparedness specifically. My subcommittee's oversight authority and expertise in emergency management had allowed me to see patterns that might have taken law enforcement months or years to discover through traditional investigative methods. "What we need from you, Agent," Torres continued, "is cooperation in a coordinated investigation that will gather evidence against all participants while minimizing disruption to essential emergency response capabilities. This will require discretion and patience. We'll need to build cases against individuals without compromising the agency's ability to respond to real emergencies." The investigation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in my government career. For 6 months, I worked closely with FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and auditors from multiple agencies to document the scope of the corruption and identify all participants in the scheme. My role was to continue normal subcommittee operations while quietly gathering additional evidence and providing cover for investigative activities. The most challenging aspect was maintaining normal relationships with agency officials who I knew were under investigation. During oversight hearings and coordination meetings, I had to interact professionally with people I suspected of stealing money intended to protect American communities during emergencies. The cognitive dissonance was intense. These were individuals I'd worked with on legitimate emergency response efforts, people whose expertise had been valuable during the contamination crisis and hurricane response. Michelle checked in with me regularly during this period, and she could tell the investigation was taking a personal toll, even though I couldn't share specifics about what I was working on. "You seem different lately," she said during one of our phone calls. "More tense, like you're carrying around some kind of weight you can't put down." She wasn't wrong. Discovering the extent of the corruption had fundamentally changed how I viewed the federal emergency management system I'd spent years working to improve. The same agencies and officials I'd praised for their response during crises had been systematically undermining emergency preparedness capabilities for personal gain. It was a betrayal not just of public trust, but of the communities that depended on effective government response during their most vulnerable moments. The arrests began on a Tuesday morning in early March, coordinated across 6 federal agencies and 12 locations in 8 different states. FBI agents executed search warrants simultaneously at government offices, private companies, and personal residences, seizing computers, financial records, and communications that documented the full scope of the procurement fraud scheme. I was in my Senate office when Agent Torres called to inform me that the operation was underway. 23 individuals are being arrested today, she said, including 14 federal employees and 9 private sector accomplices. The charges include conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and violations of federal procurement regulations. Watching the news coverage of the arrests was surreal. Federal employees being led away in handcuffs from agencies where I'd attended, meetings and coordinated emergency response efforts. Private contractors whose companies I'd unknowingly worked with during disaster relief operations being charged with defrauding the government of hundreds of millions of dollars. The media response was immediate and intense. Cable news programs featured hour-long segments analyzing the scope of the corruption, the impact on emergency preparedness, and the investigative process that had led to the arrests. Editorial boards praised the investigation while questioning how such systematic fraud had been allowed to continue for years without detection. But what struck me most was the response from emergency management professionals who weren't involved in the corruption. Career civil servants who had dedicated their lives to protecting communities during disasters expressed relief that the scheme had been exposed, frustration that corrupt colleagues had undermined their work, and determination to rebuild trust in federal emergency management capabilities. Director Michael Chen of FEMA called me personally to thank me for the investigation and to discuss how we could work together to strengthen procurement oversight and prevent similar corruption in the future. Senator Martinez, he said, what you've uncovered explains why our equipment budgets never seemed adequate despite substantial funding increases. Knowing that millions of dollars were being stolen rather than invested in preparedness capabilities helps us understand resource shortfalls we couldn't previously explain. The congressional hearings that followed the arrests were some of the most intense I'd participated in as either a staff member or a senator. My subcommittee held 6 days of public hearings examining the procurement fraud scheme, with testimony from FBI agents, federal prosecutors, agency officials, and representatives from communities that had been affected by inadequate emergency preparedness resulting from the diverted funds. The most powerful testimony came from Maria Gonzalez, the emergency management director for a county in Florida that had been devastated by a hurricane 2 years earlier. She explained how equipment failures during the response had directly resulted from purchasing substandard supplies at inflated prices through the corrupt procurement network. Senator Martinez, she said, looking directly at me during her testimony, the portable generators we received through federal assistance programs failed within hours of deployment because they were refurbished units sold to the government as new equipment at premium prices. Families lost power to critical medical equipment because corrupt officials prioritized profit over the quality of emergency supplies. Her testimony was devastating, not just because of the human impact she described, but because it made the connection between abstract financial corruption and concrete harm to real people during genuine emergencies. This wasn't just about stealing government money, it was about endangering lives for personal gain. The criminal trials that resulted from the investigation stretched over 18 months, with convictions for all 23 defendants on charges ranging from conspiracy to money laundering. The sentences were substantial, reflecting both the financial scope of the crimes and their impact on public safety. The lead organizer of the scheme, a former Pentagon procurement officer who had orchestrated much of the corruption, received a 15-year federal prison sentence and was ordered to pay restitution of over $40 million. But the legal consequences were only part of the resolution. My subcommittee worked with agency leadership to develop new procurement oversight procedures, mandatory competitive bidding requirements, and enhanced monitoring systems that would make similar corruption much more difficult to execute and easier to detect. We also secured congressional funding for emergency equipment replacement programs that would allow agencies to upgrade supplies that had been compromised by the fraud scheme. Communities across the country would receive new, properly functioning emergency equipment to replace the substandard materials they'd unknowingly received through corrupt procurement processes. The investigation and its aftermath established my reputation as someone who understood not just policy development, but the implementation challenges that could undermine even well-designed programs. Other senators began reaching out for advice on oversight strategies, and I was invited to serve on the Senate Homeland Security Committee, which had broader jurisdiction over federal emergency preparedness and security issues. Michelle's pride in my work during this period was different from her earlier admiration for my crisis response capabilities. "What you did with that corruption investigation," she said during a visit to Washington for the final congressional hearings, "wasn't just good government work. It was genuinely heroic. You exposed people who were stealing money meant to protect families during emergencies. That takes real courage." She was right that it had required courage, but it was courage of a different kind than what most people associated with heroic action. It was the courage to pursue uncomfortable truths, to challenge systems and relationships I was part of, to risk political backlash by exposing corruption that implicated respected officials and established companies. The procurement fraud investigation also strengthened my working relationships with senators from both parties who were serious about government accountability. Republican senators who might have been skeptical of my policy positions respected my commitment to rooting out waste and corruption. Democratic senators appreciated my willingness to investigate problems, even when they reflected poorly on federal agencies and programs we generally supported. This bipartisan credibility became crucial when I began working on comprehensive emergency preparedness legislation that would address not just procurement oversight, but the underlying coordination and planning challenges that made communities vulnerable during disasters. The bill required input and support from senators representing states with very different emergency preparedness needs and political priorities. Senator James Morrison, a conservative Republican from Texas who initially opposed expanded federal emergency management funding, became one of the legislation's strongest supporters after seeing how the corruption investigation had revealed systemic problems that affected communities regardless of their political preferences. "Senator Martinez," he said during one of our negotiating sessions, "you've convinced me that effective emergency preparedness isn't a partisan issue. When disasters hit, people need government that works efficiently and honestly, regardless of whether they vote Republican or Democrat." The Emergency Preparedness Accountability Act that emerged from these bipartisan negotiations was one of the most comprehensive reforms of federal disaster response capabilities in decades. It established new oversight mechanisms, mandated competitive bidding for emergency equipment contracts, created whistleblower protections for federal employees who reported corruption, and provided funding for community-level preparedness programs that would reduce dependence on federal response capabilities. The bill passed the Senate by a vote of 87 to 13, with overwhelming support from both parties. It was the kind of decisive victory that reflected not just good policy, but effective political coalition building across ideological and regional divisions. President Williams signed the legislation in a Rose Garden ceremony attended by emergency management officials, community leaders from disaster-affected areas, and family members of people who had been harmed by the corruption scheme. Standing behind the president as he signed the bill into law, I thought about the path that had led from reviewing routine procurement records to fundamentally reforming federal emergency preparedness capabilities. The ceremony was attended by my entire family, including Michelle, who had become genuinely interested in emergency management policy and had started volunteering with local disaster preparedness organizations in Virginia. Watching her talk knowledgeably with FEMA officials about community resilience planning was one of the most satisfying moments of the entire legislative process. "You know what's amazing about this?" Michelle said as we walked through the white house gardens after the signing ceremony. 5 years ago, I thought your government work was boring and unimportant. Now I understand that what you do affects whether families have power during hurricanes, whether hospitals have supplies during emergencies, whether communities can recover from disasters. It's not boring at all. It's absolutely essential. The success of the emergency preparedness legislation led to new leadership opportunities within the Senate that I hadn't anticipated. The majority leader asked me to chair a new bipartisan task force on government accountability, recognizing that my experience with the procurement fraud investigation had demonstrated both investigative capability and the political skill to build coalitions around oversight issues. The task force was given broad authority to examine waste, fraud, and inefficiency across federal agencies, with particular focus on programs where poor oversight could affect public safety or national security. It was exactly the kind of role that utilized all the skills I'd developed throughout my government career: policy analysis, stakeholder coordination, coalition building, and the patience to pursue complex investigations that might take months or years to yield results. But what satisfied me most about the new role was its potential to prevent future corruption, rather than just responding to problems after they'd already caused harm. The procurement fraud scheme had operated for 5 years before being detected, stealing hundreds of millions of dollars and undermining emergency preparedness capabilities. Better oversight mechanisms might have identified the corruption much earlier, saving money and potentially saving lives. Working on government accountability also reconnected me with the fundamental reasons I'd been drawn to public service in the first place. Government, at its best, was a mechanism for communities to work together on challenges too large for individual solutions. But government could only serve that function effectively if it operated with integrity, efficiency, and genuine commitment to the public interest rather than private gain. The procurement fraud investigation had revealed how corruption could undermine even the most essential government functions, but it had also demonstrated how dedicated public servants working within democratic institutions and legal frameworks could expose wrongdoing and implement reforms that would better protect the communities they served. As I settled into my role chairing the Accountability Task Force, I often reflected on Michelle's observation that my work was absolutely essential rather than boring or unimportant. The recognition felt good, but what mattered more was the understanding behind it, that effective governance required sustained attention to details that might seem mundane but could have profound consequences for real people's lives. The title, Madam Senator, still carried weight and responsibility that sometimes felt overwhelming. But the corruption investigation had proven that I was capable of using that platform not just to advance policy priorities, but to protect the integrity of the democratic institutions that made all other progress possible. That responsibility, challenging as it was, felt like exactly what I'd been preparing for throughout my entire career in public service. The phone call that would change everything came on a Thursday afternoon in late September of my 5th year as senator. I was reviewing briefing materials for an upcoming Intelligence Committee meeting when my chief of staff knocked on my office door with an expression I'd learned to recognize as either very good news or very serious trouble. "Senator Martinez," he said, closing the door behind him, "I just received a call from the White House. The president wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. They're calling it a private consultation, but the chief of staff mentioned it relates to national security priorities and your oversight work." My immediate assumption was that this was about the Government Accountability Task Force I'd been chairing for the past year. We'd been investigating defense contractor relationships and had uncovered some irregularities in cybersecurity procurement that might have implications for national security. But something about the tone of the request suggested this was bigger than routine oversight coordination. The next morning, I arrived at the White House 30 minutes early, using the time to review everything I knew about current national security challenges and any potential connections to my committee work. The Oval Office meeting included President Williams, National Security Advisor Patricia Reed, and CIA Director Thomas Anderson, a level of participation that immediately told me this wasn't about routine policy consultation. "Senator Martinez," President Williams began after we'd exchanged pleasantries, "I asked you here because we have a situation that requires someone with your particular combination of expertise and integrity. What I'm about to share with you is classified at the highest levels, and I need your commitment that this conversation remains completely confidential until we determine how to proceed." I nodded my agreement, and Director Anderson opened a thick folder containing satellite imagery, intelligence assessments, and what appeared to be intercepted communications. "We have evidence," he said, "that a foreign intelligence service has been systematically infiltrating federal contracting networks, specifically targeting emergency preparedness and critical infrastructure programs." The scope of what he was describing was staggering. According to the intelligence reports, operatives from a hostile nation had spent over 3 years establishing shell companies, recruiting corrupt federal employees, and gaining access to sensitive information about American emergency response capabilities, power grid vulnerabilities, and telecommunications infrastructure. "The procurement fraud you uncovered last year," National Security Advisor Reid explained, "wasn't just about stealing money. It was part of a broader intelligence operation designed to identify and compromise critical infrastructure systems. The foreign operatives were using corrupt procurement officers to gain access to detailed information about emergency response protocols, equipment specifications, and coordination procedures." My mind raced through the implications. The corruption investigation I'd led had exposed financial fraud, but if these intelligence assessments were accurate, that fraud had been a cover for something far more dangerous. Foreign agents had been systematically gathering information that could be used to disrupt American emergency response capabilities during a crisis, potentially leaving communities vulnerable during natural disasters or national security emergencies. "What do you need from me?" I asked, understanding that this briefing was leading toward a specific request. President Williams leaned forward in his chair. "We need someone to lead a comprehensive investigation into the security implications of federal contracting vulnerabilities. Someone with deep knowledge of emergency management systems, experience with complex investigations, and the political credibility to work across party lines on what could become a very sensitive national security issue." Director Anderson added, "The investigation would require security clearance at levels beyond what most senators typically receive. You'd be working directly with intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and potentially foreign intelligence services through controlled operations. It's not the kind of assignment we offer lightly." The weight of what they were asking hit me immediately. This wasn't just about oversight or policy development. It was about protecting national security in ways that went far beyond typical Senate responsibilities. But it was also exactly the kind of challenge that my entire career in government service had been preparing me for. "I accept," I said without hesitation. "When do we begin?" The security clearance process that followed was more intensive than anything I'd experienced, involving polygraph examinations, extensive background investigations, and briefings on intelligence methods and national security protocols that I'd never imagined I'd have access to as a senator. Within 2 weeks, I was cleared for information at classification levels that fewer than 50 people in the federal government were authorized to receive. My first classified briefing took place in a secure facility beneath the Capitol building that I'd never known existed. The intelligence picture that emerged over 3 hours of presentations was both more complex and more disturbing than what I'd been told in the Oval Office. The foreign intelligence operation hadn't just targeted emergency management contracting, it had systematically infiltrated multiple aspects of American critical infrastructure over nearly 5 years. Telecommunications networks, power grid management systems, water treatment facilities, transportation coordination systems, and financial networks had all been compromised to varying degrees through a combination of cyber operations, human intelligence, recruitment, and the kind of procurement fraud I'd uncovered. "Senator Martinez," said Deputy CIA Director Catherine Walsh, who was leading the briefing. What makes this operation particularly sophisticated is how they've used legitimate business relationships and government contracting processes to gain access to systems and information that would be nearly impossible to compromise through traditional espionage methods. The foreign operatives had established what appeared to be legitimate American companies, hired former government employees with security clearances and institutional knowledge, and then used those relationships to bid on federal contracts that would give them access to sensitive infrastructure information. The corruption aspect, the inflated prices and kickbacks, had been designed not just to generate revenue, but to ensure that their companies would be selected for contracts that provided access to critical systems. The most concerning aspect, Director Walsh continued, is that we believe they now have detailed knowledge of American emergency response protocols that could be used to maximize damage during a coordinated attack. They know which systems failures would cause the most disruption, which backup procedures exist, and how long it would take to restore critical services. The investigation that followed consumed the next 8 months of my life. Working with a joint task force that included FBI counterintelligence agents, CIA operations officers, Defense Department cybersecurity specialists, and investigators. From multiple federal agencies, we methodically traced the extent of the foreign infiltration and began developing strategies to counter the threat. The most challenging aspect was maintaining operational security while conducting a comprehensive investigation. The foreign operatives were sophisticated enough to have monitoring capabilities within federal agencies, which meant that traditional oversight methods could potentially compromise the investigation. We had to develop entirely new procedures for secure communication, document review, and coordination between agencies. Michelle noticed the change in my schedule and demeanor immediately. "You've disappeared again," she said during one of our phone calls. "Different from the corruption investigation, though. This feels more serious, more personal somehow." She was right that it felt personal, though I couldn't explain why to her. Learning that foreign agents had systematically exploited vulnerabilities in systems I'd worked to improve, had used the very procurement processes I'd helped reform as weapons against American infrastructure, created a sense of professional violation that went beyond policy disagreements or political conflicts. The breakthrough came when we identified a pattern in the telecommunications contracts that had been awarded to foreign-influenced companies. Cross-referencing those contracts with known intelligence activities revealed that the operatives had gained access to emergency communication networks used by first responders, FEMA coordination centers, and military installations across 12 states. "This is worse than we initially assessed," Director Anderson told me during a secure briefing in January. "They haven't just gathered intelligence about our emergency response capabilities. They've positioned themselves to actively disrupt those capabilities during a crisis. They could potentially cut communications between emergency responders, interfere with coordination between federal agencies, or even impersonate official emergency communications." The implications were terrifying. During a natural disaster, terrorist attack, or military conflict, the foreign operatives could use their access to critical communications infrastructure to create confusion, delay response efforts, and potentially cause additional casualties by preventing effective coordination between emergency services. Working with the National Security Council, we developed a comprehensive response strategy that would neutralize the immediate threat while also strengthening infrastructure security for the long term. The plan involved coordinated arrests of foreign operatives and their American accomplices, immediate replacement of compromised communications equipment, enhanced security protocols for all critical infrastructure contracting, and new oversight mechanisms that would prevent similar infiltration in the future. The operation to neutralize the foreign intelligence network was scheduled for early March, involving simultaneous actions across 15 states and coordination with allied intelligence services to address international aspects of the operation. 2 days before the planned arrests, I received a call that changed everything. "Senator Martinez," said Director Walsh during a secure phone call, We have intelligence suggesting that the foreign operatives are planning to activate their infrastructure access within the next week. We believe they're planning to disrupt emergency communications during the spring severe weather season as a demonstration of their capabilities. The timeline had accelerated dramatically. Instead of waiting for ideal conditions to roll up the network, we had to act immediately to prevent what could be an attack on American emergency response capabilities that might cost lives during tornado season across the Midwest and South. I spent the next 72 hours in the White House Situation Room, coordinating with intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and infrastructure security teams as the largest counterintelligence operation in decades unfolded across the country. Federal agents arrested 43 individuals in simultaneous raids, while cybersecurity teams worked to secure compromised systems and restore trusted communications networks. The most dramatic moment came when FBI agents raided a telecommunications facility in Kansas where foreign operatives had been preparing to deploy malware that would have disabled emergency communications across a 6-state region. The timing was crucial. Severe weather warnings were already being issued for areas that would have been affected by the communications disruption. Senator Martinez, President Williams said as we watched the operation conclude successfully, "You've helped prevent what could have been a catastrophic attack on American emergency response capabilities. The work you've done over the past 8 months has literally saved lives." The public announcement of the counterintelligence operation was carefully calibrated to inform Americans about the threat, while not revealing operational details that might compromise ongoing security efforts. President Williams addressed the nation from the Oval Office, explaining that a foreign intelligence network had been disrupted and that critical infrastructure security was being enhanced, but the full scope of the operation remained classified. My role in leading the investigation became public knowledge, though many details remained classified. The media coverage focused on how my previous experience with procurement fraud investigation had been crucial to identifying the national security implications of infrastructure vulnerabilities. Michelle called me the evening after the president's address, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and concern that I'd never heard before. "I've been watching the news coverage about this intelligence operation," she said. "They're saying you led an investigation that prevented a major attack on American infrastructure. Is that true?" "I can't discuss the classified aspects," I replied. "But yes, I've been working on infrastructure security issues that turned out to be more serious than we initially realized." "Jessica," she said, using my full name in a way that conveyed the gravity of what she was thinking. "I need you to know that I finally understand what you've been doing all these years. This isn't just about policy or politics or even good government. You've been protecting people, all of us, from threats we don't even know exist." Her recognition meant more to me than any media coverage or political praise could have. For years, Michelle had seen my government career as a safe but ultimately unambitious choice. Now she understood that public service could involve genuine courage, real sacrifice, and responsibilities that went far beyond what most people ever knew about. The counterintelligence operation led to new leadership opportunities that I'd never imagined when I first started as a policy analyst. President Williams asked me to serve on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, providing oversight of intelligence community activities from outside the executive branch. The Senate leadership appointed me to chair a new subcommittee on infrastructure security, with jurisdiction over the intersection between national security and critical systems. But perhaps most significantly, I was invited to participate in international security coordination efforts, working with allied nations to address similar vulnerabilities in their infrastructure systems. The foreign intelligence operation hadn't been limited to the United States, and the response required coordination between countries that shared similar infrastructure vulnerabilities. During a NATO security conference in Brussels, I presented the lessons learned from our investigation to defense and intelligence officials from 26 countries. Standing at the podium in a room filled with generals, intelligence directors, and cabinet-level officials, I reflected on the path that had led from analyzing healthcare policy to briefing international allies on infrastructure security threats. The response from Allied officials was immediate and substantive. Several countries requested detailed briefings on our investigation methods and security improvements. The European Union asked me to consult on their critical infrastructure protection programs. Canada invited me to participate in a joint task force addressing cross-border infrastructure vulnerabilities. These international security responsibilities represented a level of influence and responsibility that extended far beyond traditional Senate activities. I was no longer just representing my state's interests in federal legislation. I was helping to shape international security cooperation that could affect the safety and security of millions of people across multiple countries. When I returned from the NATO conference, Michelle was waiting at Reagan National Airport with a sign that read, "Welcome home, Madam Senator," written in her distinctive handwriting. It was a small gesture, but it represented the complete transformation in how she viewed my career and the work I was doing. "You know what I realized while you were overseas?" she said, as we drove back toward the city. "All those years when I thought you were settling for less, you were actually preparing for more responsibility than I ever imagined possible. You're not just a senator now. You're someone that other countries turn to for expertise on protecting their people from threats they can't see coming." The recognition from Michelle, combined with the success of the counterintelligence operation, created a sense of professional fulfillment that went beyond anything I'd experienced in my government career. The skills I'd developed, analyzing policy, the relationships I'd built throughout the federal government, the patience I'd learned during years of detailed oversight work, all of it had contributed to preventing what could have been a devastating attack on American infrastructure. But what satisfied me most was the knowledge that the work itself, not the recognition or the titles or the increased responsibilities, remained focused on the fundamental purpose that had drawn me to public service in the first place. Government, at its best, was still about communities working together to solve problems too large for individual solutions. The difference was that now those problems included threats that most people would never know existed, and the communities I was working to protect included not just my constituents, but millions of people whose safety depended on infrastructure systems they took for granted. The Secret Service detail that had been assigned to me after the counterintelligence operation became public was a constant reminder of how much my role had evolved since those early days as a junior policy analyst. When Agent Martinez addressed me as Madam Senator during security briefings, the title carried weight that extended far beyond electoral politics into matters of genuine national security. As I settled into my expanded responsibilities for infrastructure security and international cooperation, I often thought about that Thanksgiving dinner when Michelle had mocked my boring government job in front of our entire family. The assumption that government work was somehow less challenging or important than private sector success had been completely reversed. Michelle now regularly told people that her sister was doing work that affects the security of the entire country, and she'd developed a sophisticated understanding of infrastructure vulnerabilities that rivaled that of many policy professionals. The transformation in my family's perception of my career was complete, but more importantly, I'd discovered that the path from policy analyst to senator to international security expert had been not just professionally rewarding, but personally fulfilling in ways I'd never anticipated. The responsibility was enormous. The challenges were constantly evolving, and the potential consequences of failure were higher than I'd ever imagined. But it was exactly the kind of work I'd been unconsciously preparing for throughout my entire career in public service. The moment that crystallized everything happened during what should have been a routine family dinner at my parents' house in suburban Virginia. It was Michelle's 40th birthday, and for the first time in years, the entire extended family had gathered to celebrate. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends filled the dining room and spilled into the living room, creating the kind of boisterous family atmosphere that had been the backdrop for so many years of Michelle's professional victories and my quiet, government work. But this time was different. Instead of Michelle dominating the conversation with real estate success stories, I found myself surrounded by relatives asking detailed questions about national security, infrastructure protection, and international cooperation. My cousin David, who worked as an engineer for a telecommunications company, wanted to understand how foreign operatives had infiltrated critical systems. Uncle Frank, a retired military officer, was fascinated by the coordination required for the counterintelligence operation. Even my grandmother, now 92 and sharp as ever, asked perceptive questions about how government oversight could prevent future security threats. Michelle watched this transformation with a mixture of amusement and genuine pride. At one point, she pulled me aside in the kitchen while we were helping Mom prepare dessert. "You know what's funny?" she said, arranging birthday candles on her cake. 10 years ago, everyone felt sorry for you because you'd chosen such a boring career. Now you're the most interesting person in the room, and everyone wants to understand what you do." She was right about the shift, but what struck me most was how natural it felt. The questions from family members weren't about politics or electoral success. They were about the substance of the work itself. How do you identify security vulnerabilities in systems that millions of people depend on? How do you coordinate between agencies that have different priorities and protocols? How do you build international partnerships that protect communities from threats they'll never know existed? These were the questions that had driven my career from the beginning, and being able to discuss them openly with people I cared about felt like a kind of professional homecoming. The work that had once seemed too complex or mundane to explain at family gatherings had become something that even my relatives found compelling and important. Later that evening, after the guests had left and we were cleaning up, Dad approached me with a thoughtful expression. "Jessica," he said, "I've been thinking about something all evening. When you started working for the government, I was proud of you for choosing public service, but I'll admit I worried you might not have the impact you wanted. Watching you tonight, hearing about everything you've accomplished, I realize I had it completely backwards." He paused, arranging chairs around the dining table. "The impact you've had isn't just on policy or even national security. You've changed how our whole family thinks about government, about public service, about what it means to dedicate your career to something bigger than personal success. That's a legacy that goes beyond any individual achievement." His observation resonated deeply because it captured something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. The transformation in my family's understanding of public service represented something larger than recognition of my individual career progression. It reflected a broader shift in how they viewed the role of government in protecting and serving communities. Michelle, who had once seen government work as a consolation prize for people who couldn't succeed in the private sector, now regularly volunteered for local emergency preparedness organizations and had become an advocate for infrastructure investment in her real estate community. Mom had joined the board of a nonprofit organization that provided support services for military families, applying the same organizational skills she'd used in her pharmaceutical career. Dad had started tutoring students who were interested in public service careers, sharing his decades of experience in education while encouraging young people to consider government work. The ripple effects of my career had influenced not just how my family viewed my work, but how they understood their own potential contributions to their communities. Public service wasn't something that happened in Washington. It was something that happened wherever people chose to prioritize collective well-being over individual advancement. 3 months after Michelle's birthday dinner, I received an invitation that represented the culmination of everything I'd worked toward throughout my government career. The United Nations Secretary General requested that I lead an international task force on critical infrastructure protection, bringing together security experts, policy analysts, and government officials from 37 countries to develop comprehensive strategies for protecting civilian infrastructure from both cyber and physical threats. The appointment was unprecedented for a sitting U.S. senator, requiring approval from the State Department, coordination with international allies, and careful management of the relationship between my domestic responsibilities and international duties. But it was also exactly the kind of role that my unique combination of policy expertise, investigative experience, and international security knowledge had prepared me to fulfill. Michelle flew down to Washington for the announcement ceremony at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Standing in the General Assembly Hall where I'd watched historic speeches and diplomatic negotiations on television throughout my career, I delivered remarks about the importance of international cooperation in protecting the infrastructure systems that billions of people depended on every day. The threats we face, I told the assembled delegates, do not respect national boundaries. A cyber attack on telecommunications infrastructure in one country can disrupt emergency services across an entire region. A coordinated assault on power, grid systems can affect international commerce, transportation networks, and the basic services that communities need to function safely. After the ceremony, Michelle and I walked through Central Park, reflecting on the journey that had led from my first day as a junior policy analyst to addressing the United Nations about international security cooperation. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd listened to my advice about leaving government work? She asked with a self-deprecating smile. I considered the question seriously. I think I would have been successful in whatever I chose to do, I said. Finally. But I would have missed the opportunity to work on problems that really matter, to be part of something bigger than individual achievement. And our family would have missed the chance to understand what public service can really accomplish. The UN task force work required extensive travel and coordination with government officials, security experts, and policy analysts from around the world. Over the following year, I found myself briefing Parliament members in London about telecommunication security, consulting with cybersecurity specialists in Tokyo about power grid protection, and coordinating with emergency management officials in Berlin about international disaster response protocols. Each of these interactions reinforced my understanding of how interconnected modern infrastructure systems had become, and how important international cooperation was for protecting the communities that depended on those systems. The expertise I'd developed through years of American government service was directly applicable to infrastructure challenges that countries around the world were facing. But what surprised me most was how much I learned from international colleagues who approached similar problems from different perspectives. The emergency response protocols used in Scandinavian countries, the cybersecurity innovations developed in Israel, the infrastructure coordination methods pioneered in Singapore. All of these offered insights that could improve American systems while also contributing to global security cooperation. The final report of the UN task force, released 18 months after my appointment, established new international standards for infrastructure protection, created protocols for information sharing between allied nations, and developed coordinated response procedures for global infrastructure threats. It was the kind of comprehensive policy framework that would influence international security cooperation for decades to come. At the report's presentation to the UN Security Council, Secretary General Rodriguez introduced me as a policy expert whose work has fundamentally strengthened international infrastructure security and demonstrated the vital importance of technical expertise in diplomatic cooperation. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more was knowing that the framework we'd developed would help protect millions of people from threats they would never know existed. When I returned to Washington after completing the UN assignment, the contrast with my early years as a policy analyst was striking. Instead of analyzing problems and making recommendations to other people, I was now helping to shape international policy that would be implemented by governments around the world. Instead of working within existing systems, I was helping to create new frameworks for cooperation that would influence how nations protected their citizens for years to come. The Secret Service agent who met me at Reagan National Airport still addressed me as Madam Senator, But the title now carried additional weight from the international responsibilities I'd taken on. Michelle, who had come to meet my flight, noticed the security protocols immediately. "It's strange seeing you with all this protection," she said as we walked through the terminal surrounded by agents. "Not because it's impressive, though it is, but because it makes real how much responsibility you're carrying. People's safety literally depends on the work you're doing." She was right about the responsibility, and it was something I thought about every day. The infrastructure systems that billions of people took for granted, electricity, telecommunications, transportation, water treatment, all depended on security measures and international cooperation that required constant attention and updating. The work was never finished, the threats were constantly evolving, and the consequences of failure could affect millions of lives. But it was also the most fulfilling work I could imagine doing. Every policy framework we developed, every security protocol we implemented, every international partnership we strengthened made communities around the world safer and more resilient. The impact was measurable not just in prevented attacks or improved response capabilities, but in the peace of mind that came from knowing that dedicated professionals were working to protect the systems that modern society depended on. During my 6th year as senator, I received a call from President Williams asking me to consider serving as Secretary of Homeland Security in his 2nd term. It was an offer that would have represented the pinnacle of my government career, with cabinet-level authority over all aspects of domestic security and emergency preparedness. I thought carefully about the offer for several weeks, consulting with mentors, family members, and colleagues about whether the role would allow me to continue the international cooperation work that had become central to my understanding of effective security policy. Ultimately, I decided to remain in the Senate, where I could maintain both domestic oversight responsibilities and international coordination duties without the partisan pressures that came with executive branch positions. The decision felt right, not because the cabinet position wasn't appealing, but because my current role allowed me to work on infrastructure security and international cooperation from a unique perspective that combined legislative authority with policy expertise and global relationships. It was exactly the kind of position that maximized my ability to contribute to the challenges I cared most about addressing. Michelle's response to my decision was characteristically direct. "6 years ago, you would have taken any promotion offered to you because you weren't sure of your own value," she said during one of our phone conversations. "Now you're turning down cabinet positions because you know exactly what kind of work you want to do and how to do it most effectively. That's real confidence." She was right about the confidence, but it was confidence born from years of proving to myself and others that the work itself was what mattered, not the titles or recognition that came with it. The satisfaction of preventing infrastructure attacks, improving emergency response capabilities, and strengthening international security cooperation was more meaningful than any individual achievement or position. As I settled into my continued Senate responsibilities with enhanced focus on infrastructure security and international cooperation, I often reflected on that Thanksgiving dinner when Michelle had mocked my boring government job in front of our entire family. The assumption behind her criticism, that government work was somehow less challenging or important than private sector success, had been completely transformed through the work itself. Michelle now introduced me to her friends as my sister, who protects critical infrastructure for the entire country and works with governments around the world on security issues. The dismissive tone was gone, replaced by genuine understanding of the complexity and importance of the work I was doing. But what satisfied me most was that her changed perspective reflected a broader understanding of what public service could accomplish when it was pursued with dedication, expertise, and genuine commitment to serving communities rather than advancing individual careers. The path from policy analyst to senator to international security expert hadn't been planned, but it had been purposeful, building steadily on skills and relationships that ultimately allowed me to contribute to challenges that affected millions of people's safety and security. The title Madam Senator still carried the weight of responsibility for representing my constituents and protecting American interests. But it also represented something larger, the privilege of working on problems that mattered, the opportunity to contribute to solutions that would outlast my own career, and the satisfaction of knowing that the boring government job Michelle had once mocked had become exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd always hoped to do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.